Hello class, this is Dr. Tony Richie. As we begin to move in TS 630 online, Theology of the Holy Spirit, into our fourth week or unit of study, we will begin looking at some of the historical information and developments in pneumatology or Theology of the Holy Spirit. Previously, we've looked at some basic and biblical background information and some of the theological categories that arise out of that rich scriptural heritage. At this point, we begin to go into some of the major developments of thought throughout the history of Christianity, and these are often divided into two broad classifications of Eastern and Western. This is the case simply because that geographically the development of pneumatology was affected by various centers of thought. What I would emphasize to us today as we begin this part of our study, beginning with the East, the earliest and oldest of the pneumatological traditions, would be that there is a distinctive Eastern emphasis on pneumatology. I'll repeat that. There is a distinctive Eastern emphasis on pneumatology. The East tends to be more pneumatological in its orientation and more participatory in that orientation to pneumatology. In other words, in the Eastern Christian tradition on Holy Spirit, there is more of an idea of participating in the Spirit and of the transformation that takes place as a result of that. The West has tended to be caught up with the Christological categories and also with the forensic or legal status or standing of the believer before the court of God. Of course, there is no reason for us today to consider these as being mutually exclusive. In fact, undoubtedly, they are different elements that indicate the overall diversity and richness of the gospel itself. Yet, geographically and theologically, there have been different emphases on pneumatology in the overall Christian tradition. Now, Protestantism, beginning, of course, in the 16th century, with officially at least with Martin Luther and John Calvin and others, has tended to be heavily influenced by the Western tradition. In spite of breaking off from Rome, Protestantism has nevertheless been heavily influenced by Rome in its basic categories of thought. Pentecostalism, especially as it exists in the United States and in Europe, has also been heavily influenced by this Western tradition. So Protestantism and much of Pentecostalism is more Western via Rome than Eastern via Constantinople. However, it would be an oversimplification and an error to conclude that this was really cut and dried. The fact is that John Wesley, in the great Holiness and Methodist revival, and the great evangelical renewal, drew heavily in his theology on the early Eastern Fathers. In Wesley's attempt to get back to the very roots of Christian theology and spirituality, he emphasized the Bible, of course, and also the earliest days of Christian history and thought. Accordingly, he drew heavily, as I said, on some Eastern sources, Eastern Fathers. Accordingly, Pentecostalism, which is directly descended from Wesleyan holiness movements and very affected by the Wesleyan holiness approach to theology and spirituality, even though Pentecostalism, of course, has its own distinctive identity, Pentecostalism, nonetheless, through Wesley, also has certain shared emphases and tendencies with Eastern Christianity, quite independent of, if you will, Western Christianity. Of course, the most noticeable shared distinctive between Pentecostalism and Eastern Christianity would be the common emphasis on pneumatology. Eastern Christianity has very much tended to emphasize pneumatology more so than most of the West, and of course Pentecostals and Charismatics often see ourselves as restoring an imbalance in Christianity, at least as we have experienced it in the West, which has left pneumatology very much subordinate to other theological interests. Now, of course, this does not mean that Pentecostalism and Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity and such are identical by any means. Yet there's much more of a formal, sacramental, liturgical approach in Eastern Christianity historically than there is in contemporary Pentecostalism. Nevertheless, there is this emphasis on the Holy Spirit, this common pneumatological focus, if you will. Now, the distinctive doctrine of Eastern Christianity as it's come to us today is often called theosis, or divinization, or even deification. This sounds very strange to Western ears, including Pentecostal ears. It has the idea of taking on the nature of God. It is not talking about becoming, literally becoming God or divine, but it means being transformed into the image and likeness of God as there's a restoration and a healing of the sinful nature. In the West, we're much more comfortable with terminology such as sanctification, renewal, transformation, than we are such terms as theosis, divinization, deification, and such. And indeed, there's sanctification, renewal, transformation, and such language or terminology is biblically based. There are passages such as 2 Peter 1 and 4, which the East draws on for its language of theosis or deification as well. It's simply not as prominent as the Western approach, linguistically speaking. However, it is important for us as we begin this study about the East and West and the somewhat divergent development of pneumatology to understand that Pentecostalism itself draws in many ways from both the West and the East, sometimes consciously, perhaps sometimes unconsciously. And it should be interesting for us as Pentecostal theologians studying the development of pneumatological thought in Christian history to ask ourselves and examine ourselves to see where we find ourselves relating to not only either or, but both and these great traditions. Thank you